Hi, my name is Elliot Bangata, and today we're going to be going over a weapon switching mechanic in Unity. Weapon switching is a mechanic that is common in many games and often involves not just switching between weapons, but also switching between tools or any held items, and today's implementation will work for those as well. Different games usually have different methods, or sometimes multiple methods of switching between weapons, and we'll be going over three of those. First is the toggle button for toggling between weapons. Second is corresponding input buttons for each of our weapons. And third is the ability to scroll between weapons using a mouse scroll wheel. So getting right into Unity, what we have set up is a player prefab with a camera to put us in first person perspective and an empty game object to contain our weapons. Each of our weapons has this weapon tag, which will enable us to identify it within our script. And the weapon prefab, as well as the player prefab and a projectile prefab for some of our weapons will be made available. To start, we can go to weapons holder and add a new script. Call it switch weapon. Opening this in our code editor, we can get started. We'll want to define some important variables. So first we're going to want a list of game objects, each of which is going to be one of our weapons. And we're also going to keep track of our current weapon game object, as well as an int weapon index to tell us where within our list that weapon is. This will help us toggle between them. So to start, we can define them. We'll use game objects find object with tag. Find game objects with tag to get all of our game objects which have the tag weapon. We will initialize our weapon index to be 0, and we will use from the method for lists get value to help us get our initial weapon using our weapon index. I want to cast this as a game object, make sure it's of the right type. To start, we can go down to update, and we're going to use the button Q or the key Q and input get key down to determine when this is pressed as our toggle. So we'll first implement our toggle method of switching between weapons. To do this, we're going to want to increment our weapon index by 1 and call some sort of switch weapons function to allow us to switch between the weapons. We'll go and implement this here. So what we're going to want to do to switch weapons is set the current weapon to be inactive. So to do that, we can use set active false. This will deactivate our current weapon. We're also going to get a reference to our new weapon, which we can do using get value again. And our weapon index, which has been updated since we have pressed Q. And we can cast this. We also now want to set this new weapon to be active so that we can see it on our screen. And we will also want to set the current weapon now to be our new weapon, so the next time we try to switch, we can continue to do so. One small thing is that when we increment our index, we can go out of the range of our list. So we're going to want to use the modulo operator to keep ourselves within the range of our list, which we can do here. Use the modulo operator and the length of our weapons list. This will keep, when we run out of indexes within our list, we'll go back to the start, allowing us to continuously toggle as much as we would like. So we can go look at what this is like in Unity. So when we start in Unity, we will see all our weapons on the screen, but as we start to toggle by hitting Q, we'll switch between the weapons. So we'll fix that error now. The issue is that all our weapons are active at the start. So we'll create some sort of clear weapons function that will help us get rid of those. So if we just do a for each game object weapon in weapons, we will then be able to set each of them to be inactive at the start. We will also likely want to call switch weapons right at the start, just so that our first weapon shows. I guess this is optional. If you want to start with no weapons, you could just leave this out. going back to Unity and starting again, we will be able to see that we start with one weapon, and each time we press Q, we switch. Once we get to the sword, which is the last weapon, we go back to the start, which is nice. So another thing we could do briefly is to copy here, and we could implement a way to remove the weapons that we have, since we've already made a clear weapons function. Just doing this, when we press the key X, will allow us to empty our hands of any weapons that we're holding. And we can quickly move on to the next implementation, which will be one key for each weapon. We can do this easily with the number keys. So if we use alpha 1, 2, and 3 for each of the weapons, we can map those to each of the weapons that we have by simply setting the weapon index to their corresponding index within the list. So the first weapon will be index 0, and the next will be index 1 and index 2, and so on. This is the only component that you would need to manually update. If you wanted to add more weapons in the future, you need to add a new key for each new weapon that you add, but otherwise the toggle and the scroll wheel method would work on their own. One last thing we need to do before we can go see how this works is to call this switch weapon method every time that we update the index, and maybe instead of calling it each time, we want to keep track of when it changes. We can do a current weapon index, which we can also set at the start to be the same as the weapon index. And then if the current weapon index is not equal to the weapon index, we call switch weapons. We can remove that from here. We'll also then want to set it here. So we can set the current weapon index to be equal to the weapon index each time. So now if we go back to Unity, you should be able to see every time we hit Q, we switch between weapons, and if we hit the number keys, hitting 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, it switches between our weapons successfully. Also, if we hit X, they'll disappear, and I can continue hitting buttons after that to make them come back, and that all works. So we'll go into our last implementation, or our last method of switching, which will be the mouse scroll wheel. To do this, we will use inputs getAxis method, which takes a string for us to tell it which axis we would like it to measure. In this case, we want to measure the mouse scroll wheel. It will return a float, which we will then compare to be either positive or negative to allow us to scroll in both directions and go the opposite way each time. When we scroll up, we're going to want to increment, and when we scroll down, we're going to want to decrease our index by 1. This comes with a small issue. When our index is 0, this will give us an index of -1, and the implementation of the modular operator in Unity will give us negative remainders, which will not allow us to get the current game object from our list. To fix this, we can simply add the length of our weapons list, which will put us at the same weapon, but at the end of the list in the positive direction, which will be helpful to avoid that error. Now, if we go into Unity, we can see this in action. So if we start our game, we can scroll down to go down between the weapons, up to go up one at a time. We can get rid of them with X. Scrolling will bring them back. Any sort of input will bring our weapons back after we remove them, and we can switch between them freely. So one other way that we can make this implementation useful is by going to our switch weapon script and making the current weapon a static variable so that we can access it from other scripts. So now say we have this use weapon function. This simply just fires projectiles on any weapon, but we wouldn't want a sword to fire a projectile, at least not in this case. So we can do a quick check to see if switch weapons current weapon, probably want to do it in a more robust way in the future, but for this demonstration, you can simply use the name. The name we will get from Unity is SM Weapon Short Sword. Copy that, paste it here. Now, when we check if our weapon is a sword, we can use what we have here already implemented is a sword behavior script. It's just a simple animation with the method use to just animate a swing when we click. We can get switch weapon, current weapon, get component, sword behavior, the script, and use the method use instead of firing a projectile. And then else, if we're on any other sort of weapon, we will still want to fire a projectile for now. This is just one way that the current weapon can also be used. When we go back to Unity, we'll be able to see when we're on a gun, we can shoot, but a sword will swing. Scroll between them. No projectile coming out of the sword. If we wanted to add more weapons, we could simply drag a new weapon into the weapons holder and give it the weapon tag. Then if we play our game, we will be able to scroll through just like any other weapon, or Q to toggle through like any other weapon. The only missing part would be an individual key, which could be easily added to the script. That will be all for today's tutorial, and we hope you learned something, and thank you for watching.